Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Dan Lanning, the Oregon Ducks, gearing up to head into spring practice. And I think the question now is, hey, what storylines are we going to be monitoring for this Oregon program over the next couple of weeks? And look, y'all know we've talked a lot of Oregon football over the last couple of weeks. I think I'm ready to, kind of come out and say how I feel about this team heading into spring practice. And I put a lot of thought into, hey, where does Oregon kind of sit in my preseason rankings? This is the best way I can describe Oregon going into spring practice. This is one of, if not the most complete football team from a personnel standpoint that we see in the country. And that's very similar to how we talked about this team 12 months ago going into spring practice, where you look up and down this roster, there are no position groups that we look at and say that's a really big concern heading into spring ball. There are not a lot of teams across the country that can say that. Even the national championship contending teams have certain question marks. I don't think Oregon has any glaring question marks. The question that I have for this football team is, hey, can we be elite enough at the positions necessary to go win a national championship? And I look at the past four national championship teams that we've seen in the landscape of college football. Want to know what all four of those teams had in common? And it's not the wide receivers. It's not necessarily the quarterback play either. What all of those teams have in common, I'm talking about the two Georgia teams. I'm talking about Michigan in 2023, and I'm talking about Ohio State in 2024. What did all those football teams have in common? They were elite on the defensive line. And Oregon has quietly gotten better on the defensive line since Dan Lanning has been at Oregon, but I would never use the term elite. You look back at some of the numbers, they gave up 4.2 yards per carry on the ground last year. That was 60th in the country. They sacked the quarterback 7.9% of the time. That was 27th in the country. These are good numbers, but they're not necessarily elite. At those type of positions that really determine national championship caliber teams, is Oregon good enough? That's probably the biggest question mark I have about this football team going into 2025. Want to get into a few other storylines before we get into it. As always, the Oregon Duck fans, y'all know I have a blast talking this program. The amount of support that y'all continue to show to the fellas in the dead of winter when nobody's talking college football. I can't thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, any big storylines that y'all have in the comment section, let it fly. What you guys throw down there in the comment section largely going to be what we're talking about over the next couple of weeks and months. Appreciate you guys. Without further ado, let's get into it. I want to start at the top here. Quarterback battle. Is there one? I personally do not think so. I think there's 99% of Oregon fans expect Dante Moore to be the starting quarterback. But if there's one thing we damn sure know about Dan Lanning, is that he's going to make you earn it. And so I don't think there's going to be a quote unquote quarterback one heading into spring practice. I think a lot of us expect Dante Moore to win the job, including myself. Here's what I'll say. I think it's interesting that Austin Novosad has not hit the transfer portal. And I give Austin Novosad all the credit in the world, man. I mean, you look at a lot of other quarterbacks that would be in a similar position to Austin Novosad, they'd be on a different football team right now. Austin Novosad wants to battle it out. And the fact that he is sticking around going into spring practice tells me that this kid believes that he can compete for a quarterback one job for this Oregon team. Now, I think Dante Moore is the leader in the clubhouse. He was the quarterback too last year. Austin Novosad, he was no slouch coming out of high school. This was a guy that was a top 150 national recruit, handpicked for Will Stein back in that 2023 cycle. The guy that threw for over 115 touchdowns and 9,000 yards coming out of high school in the state of Texas. Austin Novosad can rip it. We'll see kind of how that quarterback position plays out over the next couple of weeks and months. Y'all know how I feel about Dante Moore. I think he's quite frankly, from a pure arm talent standpoint, there are just not many quarterbacks that bring what Dante Moore can bring in terms of a pure thrower of the football. And I think he brings a lot more verticality to this offense than Oregon saw with Dillon Gabriel last year. And I think he can access the boundaries better. There are things that Dante Moore can do that Dillon Gabriel I don't think could. And I think that has the chance to really elevate this offense. What I want to see from Dante Moore is I don't want to hear any about turnovers. That's probably the biggest thing. You go back to his time at UCLA. He's a gunslinger quarterback that has a ton of confidence in terms of what he can do with his arm. Can he find that balance between making those high level throws, but also keeping the ball out of harm's way? That's going to be the big question for Dante Moore because I got no question marks about the ceiling he can provide to Oregon. Can he provide that high floor, similar to Dylan Gabriel, that allows Oregon to be consistent throughout that 2025 season? Number two, which wide receivers will step up? You really only have one, maybe two proven commodities in this wide receiver room, obviously headlined by Evan Stewart. That's not necessarily a bad thing when you're talking about just a loaded wide receiver room from a talent standpoint. Yeah, guys like DeCorian Moore as a true freshman, or Jeremiah McClellan going into year two, or a guy like Jurion Dickey going into year three. They're not necessarily proven at the collegiate level yet, but we all know the talent that they have. What does the wide receiver rotation look like? And the reason I'm using the term rotation is last year there wasn't much of a rotation. It was Tez Johnson, Evan Stewart, Trayshawn Holden. That was the three wide receiver set that you almost saw exclusively for Oregon when all three of them were healthy and on the football field. This year, I think there might be a little bit more of a rotation in working in 4, 5, 6 guys pretty consistently within this Oregon offense. Now, I'm prepared to give my official prediction in terms of the three top leading pass catchers for Oregon. Evan Stewart, number one, DeCorian Moore, number two, Jeremiah McClellan, number three. Those are the three wide receivers that I currently have the most confidence in going into spring practice. Malik Benson's really intriguing. Jurion Dickey's really intriguing. I think Gary Bryan is a guy that we might be sleeping on, Kyle Casper as well. And then obviously Kenny Sadiq. Kenny Sadiq offers this just he's a unicorn. I don't think it'd be surprising in the least if we look up at the end of the year and say Kenyon Sadiq's the best tight end in the country. That's how high I am in him heading into 2025. And yet, T. Ferg was awesome for Oregon. He's about as consistent as it got. Kenyon Sadiq provides a different level of athleticism and juice than a guy like Terrence Ferguson provided. How can we get him involved in the passing attack as well? Not necessarily a ton of proven wide receivers, but this is by no means a wide receiver room does not have talent. Now it's about what wide receivers step up. And again, DeCorian Moore, keep your eyes out for this kid. I think he's in that similar category in terms of how we talked about Ryan Williams and Jeremiah Smith coming out last year. I think DeCorian Moore is going to be a massive part of this Oregon offense. Number three, and this is to me the biggest question I have going into spring. I don't really have any question marks about the offensive line. I think we know what that offensive line is going to look like, and we think it's going to be pretty solid. Defensive line. Why am I so intrigued with the defensive line? Because I was going back and looking at the whole conversation around Oregon is what is it going to take to win a national championship? That is the goal for this Oregon team going into 2025, and it's anything but a national championship. I think would be considered by Dan Lanning a disappointment. That's the standard that he set in Eugene. What is it going to take? This might be the biggest question mark you have if you're an Oregon fan. Where the defensive line's gotten better and better as Dan Lanning has been there, but I would not necessarily put it in that category of elite just yet. But it does have the chance to be elite in 2025. And why am I so intrigued with the defensive line? I'm looking at past national champions. Hey, what do they all have in common? Dominant defensive lines. Georgia in 2021. Georgia in 2022. Those were two of the most dominant defensive lines we've seen in the history of college football. Michigan in 2023. Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Chris Jenkins, Derek Moore, Josiah Stewart. Loaded defensive line. Ohio State in 2024. Everybody wanted to talk about Jeremiah Smith or Travion Henderson or Quinshon Judkins. Make no mistake about it. Ohio State had the number one defense in the country last year. Why, might you ask? Because they got 5 guys who are going to go to the NFL in this year's NFL draft on the defensive line. Oregon's getting better. They were a good unit in 2024. Can they be great in 2025? Some of the names that excite me the most, like we kind of know about Mateo and Tatum. Can they be elite in 2025? That's a question. Mateo is certainly, he might be considered elite already. What about Bear Alexander, who has an incredibly high ceiling? I'll say I just saw a picture of him working out in the winter. He looks the type. That body's looking right. Amari Washington has been solid. The conversation here is, can we go from good to elite on the defensive line? That goes for Mateo. That goes for Tatum. That goes for Bear. That goes for Amari Washington. Then you got guys like Aiden Breland, Jericho Johnson, Tylen Gray, who are all going into year 2. We haven't seen a ton of them yet, but they very well could be difference makers for Oregon next year. Can we be elite on the defensive line? And I'll say this, I think Oregon's offensive line is damn good going into spring ball. If we start hearing reports that that defensive line is showing out, they're going to be able to show out against just about anybody in the country going into 2025. Number 4, secondary puzzle pieces. It's the deepest secondary room, bar none, in college football. And you all know I've made depth charts for just about every Power 4 team in the country right now. This is by far the deepest. What's it look like? If you are Dan Lanning, Tosh Lupoy heading into spring practice, we know we're going to be good. How good can we be? And what's the best recipe for the secondary? Where I look at it and say, all right, Dylan Tieman's a lock to start at safety, but you got a bunch of young safeties coming in who are coming out through the pipeline, I should say, that could be really good. Who emerges? Kingston Lopa, Peyton Woodyard, Aaron Flowers, or true freshman Trey McNutt. Okay, at the cornerback spot. To me, maybe you kick Naheem Offord to nickel. Naheem Offord might be a guy that, hey, we want to get on the football field as a freshman. He's too good to not be on the field. Well, if he can't play over Jaleel Florence or Iffy at boundary cornerback, then we'll throw him at nickel. A guy like Roderick Pleasant certainly could play. Or a guy like Sione. It's loaded in terms of the competitive depth of this room. And now if you're Tosh Lupo and Dan Lanning, there's 2 questions. It's one, how do we get all our best football players on the field? And that might require a little bit of creativity. Hey, maybe Naheem Offord's ideally a boundary cornerback later on in his career. But if he's one of our 5 best guys in the secondary, throw him at nickel and get him on the football field and let him go impact the game. It's going to be really fun to hear how this secondary shakes out. And again, that's that conversation of it's going to be really good. Can we get it to be elite in 2025? A lot of fun storylines with the one big question. Can we be good enough? Right? Because we know this team is solid. We know there's no glaring question marks about this roster going into spring practice. Can we be good enough in spring? Can we show we're good enough in spring practice? That's what I'm looking for. We'll sign out there. Going to be a really fun next couple of weeks and months. We got a lot of fireworks on the recruiting trail as well. Buckle up. It's going to be a fun next couple of weeks. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll talk to y'all later. Peace.